Organization in quilt patterns is really, really important. Often that is the difference between a really well-written pattern that is easy to follow and one that's just not. It doesn't have a ton to do with the actual instructions itself sometimes. Just kind of the order and flow of things within the pattern can actually affect the readability of it a lot. So we're going to kind of go through a definitive guide for how to organize your quilt pattern, all of the elements that you should have and what order they should be in order to maximize that readability for your customer. All right, so first things first, here are kind of a list of all of the major elements that you should have and the order they should be in. So you want to start always with a little bit of an about the design section. This is optional, but I strongly recommend it because a lot of people like to kind of read what inspired the design, a little bit of story behind it, right? That gives them something to connect to and just makes that pattern that much more meaningful for them. So if you don't include an about the design section already, strongly consider it. This doesn't have to be long. We're talking 2-3 sentences. Sometimes you can do longer for sure if there's a longer story behind it, but just a little bit of something for them to connect to is really helpful right off the bat, first page of the pattern up first before any of these other sections. The next thing that you want to include is the before you begin section. I have another video on what all should go into this section. This is really critical because this kind of sets the norms for your pattern, so you don't have to keep restating it throughout the pattern. And just kind of lets your reader know what they're in for. So make sure that's up there on the first page as well, right next to that about the design section. The next thing that you want to go into is fabric requirements. Now, this is only true if you're writing a digital pattern. If it is a paper pattern, that goes on the back of your pattern. And I will link another video here about what basically goes on the cover of your paper patterns if you're interested. Then we go into cutting instructions. You have to have fabric requirements before your cutting instructions, obviously, right? But those come up next, right? We're getting into the pattern and you want to put all of your cutting instructions in that section. You don't want to break it up piece by piece unless you're doing a block of the month, but for a regular standard pattern where it's just kind of standalone, one quilt project, maybe a couple of blocks, all of the cutting for all of the blocks and the sashing and everything else is going to go up there. Fourth item in cutting instructions, all of the cutting for the entire project. Now, number 5 here is sorting. This is only true if you've kind of got like a fat quarter pattern or something like that, where you're kind of making multiple color pairs that you need to take all of your fabrics that you've cut down and sort them into these things. Occasionally, depending on the pattern, this will actually come before cutting, right? You'll do this flat quarter sorting and pairing up before you start cutting into them. That's fine too. So these kind of 2 sections can be interchanged depending on what your pattern is. But generally, if you have to do that sorting, you want to do it now, right at the cutting section, either right before or right after, so that it's done. And you're not kind of dealing with keeping track of pieces and matching fabrics and matching pairs throughout the rest of the pattern as you're starting to deal with all of the assembly instructions. It's not really a great way to do it. It just becomes very overwhelming because by then they're focusing on all of the other things that they need to do to assemble the blocks and pieces. And so adding another layer of complexity of having to pair fabrics up or sort fabrics while they're doing that is just really difficult. Make it its own section and get it out of the way before you start getting into any assembly instructions. Next section you want to go into is unit or subunit construction. So this is where you're going to start talking about making your HSTs, making your flying geese, right? Whatever subunits you have. And also taking those subunits and assembling them into a quarter unit or a center unit or whatever happens to be for the block that you're making. If you're using those things, if it's just an amalgamation of standard shapes and units, that's fine. But we want to kind of get all of this unit and subunit construction out of the way first. And then we'll go into block construction, quilt top assembly, right? So we're starting at the smaller units and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger with each section. But you do want to call these out as their own sections. You don't want to just cram it all together into one big long set of assembly instructions. Having this broken out by header just provides those kind of landmarks that makes your customer feel like they've accomplished something, right? Like that's the satisfying check mark, right? I've completed this section. I'm moving on to the next one. So it breaks it up that way. But it also just makes it much more easy for them to keep track of where they are in the pattern if you've got these different sections broken into sections with headers rather than just one big long set of steps. Once you've got your quilt top assembled, maybe you have a section in there where you're adding borders. That needs to be its own section. There's enough going on with just assembling the quilt top that you don't want to kind of merge those things together if you can help it. If you don't have borders, feel free to script that, obviously. And then you go into your finishing instructions and then any extra information you're including in the quilt pattern. We'll talk about what some of those things are in just a minute, but you want to put that after the finishing instructions, right? The actual quilt assembly are things that every single person making this quilt needs to follow. The auxiliary information is helpful stuff. It's stuff that you might use, you might not use, but it's not critical for the quilt pattern. And so that kind of goes after all of the main critical instructions. Okay. Alrighty, let's talk about some of this auxiliary information that you might want to include. So the first thing is coloring sheets. Obviously, if you're not including these in your patterns, either digitally as a download or on the pages itself, strongly recommend adding these. A lot of people like to kind of plan out all of their fabrics before they purchase fabric or start cutting into fabric and just fully commit to it. Cutting labels, I'll link to another video about including cutting labels. Those are really helpful if you've got a lot of pieces in your quilt pattern. Any cover quilt information, so what fabrics did you use? Did you use a particular fabric line? Who quilted it? What testers you had, right? Like any of that information, if you like to include it, this goes in the auxiliary information. Some people put it right up front, like third section in on that first page. Most people are not terribly interested in it. It's just unfortunately the way it is. And so it just becomes something that they flip through quickly, trying to get to the part that they need. Anytime you add a lot of that information, it encourages them to start skipping. And when they start skipping through a quilt pattern, that's where you're at risk of somebody missing something important. And so this is auxiliary information, right? You don't need to know this stuff to make the quilt pattern. So plop it down at the end. That's the appropriate spot for this in a quilt pattern. Fabric inspiration, right? Alternate colorways, the little thumbnail mock-ups of all the different ways that you can make this quilt. Again, allude to it at the beginning. You want to tell them it's there in the before you begin section or in the about the design section, but it doesn't need to be there. They can flip to the back of the pattern if they want to see it. And then any kind of checklists. So this is really helpful if you're dealing with like a scrappy pattern or something where you're doing a repeating pattern, but there's like a lot of things going on in that repeat. So you've got maybe 8 steps to each repeat, and then you're repeating it so many times for a particular design. Sometimes it's really helpful to have a printable checklist for them to actually keep track of where they're at in the pattern so that they don't get mixed up while they're sewing and not repeat something enough or repeat it too many times or just skip a part of the repeat, right? Having some sort of checklist in there can be helpful. But again, this is something that you don't critically need for the pattern. It's just a helpful thing. So it goes in this auxiliary information section at the back. There's plenty more of things that you can add here. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these are some of the things that you can include in a pattern, especially if it's a digital pattern. All right, so now that we've talked about kind of the broad overarching sections of a quilt pattern, let's talk about kind of organization for the instructions itself. We'll go a little bit deeper dive into those things. So one way to organize these things that I really like is by increasing skill level. This is good for a couple of reasons, because if you're dealing with beginner quilters, you start with the easy stuff, you gain their confidence on that, and then you slowly, progressively get harder. So it never feels like they're hitting this massive learning curve. It just kind of progressively gets a little bit more difficult. They master that concept, get comfortable with it, and then attempt the next thing, right? That's a really good way to kind of organize your instructions. So if you're sitting there going, do I start with this subunit or that subunit or this block or that block, right? Ask yourself, what is the easiest skill? Let's start there, and then we'll progressively get harder. The other kind of organization that I really like is one block at a time and then adding repeat instructions. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. You can use more than one of these strategies at a time. But the one block of at a time and then repeat is really helpful from things getting overwhelming and also having to keep track of a ton of pieces at a time. So basically what you'll do is you'll start with making all of the subunits and pieces for one block. You'll go through the instructions of taking those subunits and assembling the block. And then at the end of that, you have a repeat instruction that says repeat steps X through X to make a total of 12 blocks or whatever it happens to be, right? And so you kind of walk it through them one at a time. Instead of having to make 105 flying geese at that particular step, you only make 4 because you only need 4 per block. And then they kind of like get the feeling, get the muscle memory for making the block, learn the skills, learn the techniques, get comfortable with them before they start going into that kind of chain piece, mass manufacturing mode that a lot of quilters actually really enjoy. Just kind of churning through a bunch of chain piecing is really fun for most of us. But again, that's a really helpful strategy just because when you're learning something new, you don't necessarily want to go and make everything at each step of the process, only to find that it's not going to work out at the end, because then you've got to recut everything. And this is the idea of a test block, right? A lot of people don't actually take the time to sew test blocks, but if you have instructions in your pattern for kind of walking them through one block at a time, and then instructing them to repeat it, you can kind of convince them to do that first block almost like a test block until they're comfortable with it. And then they can start doing 2 and 3 blocks at a time, or all of the blocks at a time if that's what they prefer. Another way that you can kind of do this is put some general instructions up at the beginning and then just kind of reference those. So this works really well, especially for block the month patterns where you're using basic HSTs assembly, basic stitch and flip, basic flying geese assembly over and over and over again, and you don't want to keep repeating yourself. So basically, after you get through the cutting instructions and the fabric requirements, you would have a set of general instructions. And these aren't actually getting followed to a T in order to make the block. This is just like, we're talking generally about how to make these subunits. And then you get into the instructions that you're actually following in order to make the quilt. And you say, okay, make 12 HSTs according to this method, make 4 flying geese according to the general method, make, whatever it happens to be. And then those are the steps that they're actually following in order to make the pieces for their quilt. The general instructions are just, here's how you do this technique, and here's the techniques that we're going to use in this quilt pattern. Not a huge fan of this technique for most quilt patterns. I think it's much better to kind of teach the technique as they're sewing, because that's how quilters learn, right? You learn new techniques by doing new techniques. But in things where you've got multiple blocks at a time, you're using the same techniques over and over again, like you do in a block of the month, or something where you've got multiple complex kind of picture pieced blocks within your quilt, this can be helpful. And then the other really good thing to do is name your subunits, right? So if you have a more complicated quilt block where you've got a corner unit and a center unit and a side unit, because you're basically going to assemble these subunit pieces, right? And then sew them together like a 9 patch or what have you, right? There's many, many different variations of this in quilt patterns, but if you've got sort of multiple rounds of sewing things together into rows and then rows together into a unit, and you're doing that multiple times in order to build up the block, it's really helpful to name those subunits, right? And so a really good way to do this is just by location, right? Center unit, corner unit, side unit, right? Just generic names. Those are really good for like star blocks, things along those lines. But if it happens to be like a picture piece thing, you're making a bird or something like that, you can talk about a beak unit or a foot unit. But having those units named rather than kind of referring to the unit from step 16 is a lot easier to keep track of in a quilt pattern, right? Because then at the end you just say, grab your beak unit, grab your feet unit, grab your wing unit, right? Lay them out as shown and start sewing them together. And it's much, much easier to recognize what you're supposed to grab, as well as just keep track of those pieces throughout. This is also true if you have kind of flying geese with lots of different variations. You can name those rather than just saying flying geese AB and flying geese BC, or like fabric A, fabric B, HST, right? Those names become very long, and so substitute it with something shorter that's a little bit more intuitive. Makes it much easier for your reader to keep track of those pieces, which makes the pattern feel easier even though you're not doing anything different. That's the beauty of organization. Alrighty, I hope you found those tips helpful. These are just some of the many things that I have picked up over the years and would love to share with you. If there is anything that comes to mind, any questions that you have, I would love to answer them. Just drop me a line in the comments and I will make a video about it. Alrighty, see you next week for Tech Tip Tuesday.